The Republicans are trying to make their second biggest mistake. Their first big mistake was banning abortion. Now their second biggest mistake is they're trying to rewrite the Constitution, which should not be rewritten. Um, as a former as former Republican Senator Rick Santorum addressed Republican lawmakers that were gathered in San Diego at the American Legislative Exchange Council Policy Summit, he detailed a plan to fundamentally remake the United States. It would become a conservative nation, which would not fly with me. And the transformation, Santorum said, culminates with an unprecedented event, a first of its kind convention to rewrite the Constitution. Basically, you take this grenade and you pull the pin. You got a live piece of ammo in your hand, Santorum, who's a two-time GOP presidential candidate and former commentator, said. He explained in an audio of his remarks obtained by the watchdog group, the Center for Media and Democracy, and he shared it with Insider. 34 states, if every Republican legislator votes for this, we have a constitutional convention. Not really. The December 2021 ALEC meeting represents a flashpoint in a movement that's spearheaded by powerful conservative interests. Some are tied to Trump world and share many of Trump's goals to alter the nation's bedrock legal text since 1788. It's an effort that has largely taken place out of public view. Now, interviews with a dozen people involved in the constitutional and convention movement, along with documents and audio recordings revealed by Insider, reveal a sprawling, well-funded, at least partly by cryptocurrency and impassioned campaign taking root across multiple states, and most notably feeling them a success, even though Trump supporters have never had success in their life anyway. So during an extraordinary few weeks in June, the Supreme Court's three new Trump appointees powered the reversal of Roe v. Wade. They forfeited the gun rights and bolstered religious freedoms. Now, future presidents have had less power to confront the climate crisis. Now, each win is the product of a steady and, in some cases, decades-long quest by conservators to bend the arc of the history rightward. Now, this isn't an exercise, either. State lawmakers are invited to huddle in Denver starting on Sunday to learn more about the inner workings of a possible constitutional convention at Academy of States 3.0, the third installment of a boot camp preparing state lawmakers, and in anticipation of an imminent Article 5 convention. Now, Rob Nadelson, who's a constitutional scholar and senior fellow at the Independence Institute, who closely studies Article 5 of the Constitution, basically predicted to Insider that there's a 50% chance that the United States will witness a constitutional convention in the next 5 years. Now, whether it does happen is highly dependent on the Republican success of winning state legislators during the 2022 midterm election. But not everyone in the conservative constitutional conventional movement believes that such a gathering is imminent. It would take years and more work to reach this goal, if we ever do at all. At minimum, the Republicans will need to flip several Democratic-controlled state legislators and convince the remaining GOP holdouts of the necessity for a convention. Now, during the process, and during the past several decades, they made progress, and lately a lot. And now they have a fucking plan to destroy everything in the world. Now, Article 5 of the U.S. Constitution provides two ways to amend the nation's organizing document, and it's the most difficult but most dramatic way to alter the American society's very foundation. Now, the first is for a 2/3 majority of Congress to propose an amendment, but three-fourths of the state have to ratify it. Now, this is how all 27 of the current amendments to the Constitution were added in. But it's a path that today is largely blocked because of intractable partisan division. No American under 30 has experienced the nation amending the Constitution in his or her lifetime. The second method, which has never before been accomplished, involves 2/3 of the U.S. states to call for a convention. The power to call for a convention belongs solely to state legislators, who would pass and ratify amendments without a governor's signature, Congress's intervention, or any input from the president, the current one, that is. Now, some states have tried and tried, without result, to prompt a constitutional convention. Together, they've issued hundreds of a pro-convention resolution or calls for over 200 years to reroute constitutional amendment powers away from Washington. Now, what's new now is the ever-evolving power coupling of a corporation that's backed ideological juggernaut led by ALEC, and which is a non-profit organization with close ties to large tobacco and drug companies, and a determined Republican Party increasingly dominating many of the nation's 50 state households. Now, if they are successful, a constitutional convention that's led by conservators could trigger sweeping changes to the Constitution. Now, now their goals include gutting the federal environmental standards, nixing nationwide education programs, and the requirement in creating an incredibly high threshold for Washington, D.C., or territory to earn statehold. Some would like to make it difficult, if not impossible, for someone like the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases expert Anthony Fauci, for example, to work for decades within the federal government. Now, the former squatter, Donald Trump, close to announcing a campaign for a second term as squatter, would find much to love about the convention movement. He's argued that Article 2 gave him sweeping powers to akin to Richard Nixon's famous declaration that when the squatter does it, that means it's not illegal. Technically it is. Trump also attempted to claim that he could unilaterally end birthright citizenship, which he cannot, and he repeatedly argued the White House didn't have to comply with congressional subpoenas. Yes, you do. The planks of the Convention of States movement, such as term limits for federal bureaucrats in addition to members of Congress, stand to attract acolytes of Trumpism, savoring the means to maggotfy the Constitution and therefore the nation. In fact, it already has. Constitutional Convention boosters include many of Trump's current and former sycophantic inbreds, including the conservative legal scholar John Eastman, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, and faux personalities like Sean Insanity and Mark Levin. Eastman, who recently had his phone seized by federal agents that were investigating Trump's attempts to overturn the 2020 presidential election results, attended a 2016 mock convention that was hosted by the Convention of States. It's the most extraordinary thing in my career that I've ever been a part of, Eastman said in the video produced by the convention simulation organizers. This process actually works. Actually, it backfired on you guys. Now, 6 years later, the Academy of States 3.0 was taking place Sunday ahead of the National Conference of State Legislators in 2022 summit in Denver. On its website, the group boldly forecasts that a new constitutional convention could take place in 24 months and quotes the former President Barack Obama, emphasizing, "You can't change Washington from the inside out. It's a heavy lift, but it's not out of reach." Arne Pearson, who's the Center for Media and Democracy's executive director and a close watcher of the conventional movement, told Insider, "This is a real threat." Now, conservators have embraced the political long game in achieving their most prized policy goals, like overturning Roe v. Wade, and the movement to call a convention may be no different. For the last 25 years, people in the pro-life movement did the blocking and tackling necessary for this day to come, Santorum said at the December 2021 ALEC summit. No one 5 years ago would have said that Roe v. Wade would be overturned, and not one person in this room would have thought so. The GOP spent decades investing in control of state legislators through well-funded and resourced groups like the Republican State Leadership Committee, which has spent tens of millions over the last few decades of locking down GOP control of state legislators, statewide offices, and judgeships. Now, those sustained investments have secured GOP dominance in state legislature for a generation, and I guarantee the GOP will also have the upper hand in a convention. A new report by the Center for Media and Democracy, first shared with Insider, and it finds that Republicans who would control at least 27 and up to 31 out of 50 delegations to a convention based on delegate selection process and applications passed thus far. That's still a tad short of what would ultimately be needed to make any changes. 2/3 of the state legislature are needed to call for a convention, and 3/4 must vote to ratify any amendments. Notably, the governors, Congress, and the White House have no role in this specific process. But the movement's most devoted sycophantic inbreds, like Santorum, say that they are in it for the long haul, and they argue that changing the Constitution is a goal existential to America's existence that looms larger than a single election cycle now. Yes, he believes that they'll have a good election, but the movement is inextricable. And why? Because every institution in America is against us. No, that's not. Santorum said, invoking the founders and their vision of federalism. "I say to you as a Republican state legislator that you actually have the key." Not really. Activists also say that with Congress sharply divided, a convention would send an unmistakable message to Washington that lawmakers need to change their way or be prepared to get run the fuck over. The states have sort of lost their vote, and all we can do now is beg from the cheap seats and say, "Hey, don't do that," said State Representative Bill Taylor South Carolina, who led his state's push to pass a call for a convention. Now faced with Washington dominated by Democrats, many conservators want to unleash a force to put the nation's capital on notice. Now the idea of states coming together is going to scare the living fuck out of Washington, Taylor told Insider. They're going to be terrified. The Republicans isn't alone in pursuing a convention. On the Democratic side, Cenk Uygur, who's a progressive commentator for Young Turks, and he founded Wolfpack in the wake of the Supreme Court's landmark 2010 decision in Citizens United vs. Federal Election Commission that accelerated an era of big money politics. Now, 5 Democratic states passed the Wolfpack Act, which is a call for a campaign finance reform that's focused for a reform-focused convention in California, New Jersey, Illinois, Vermont, and Rhode Island. Now, Cenk Uygur's organization is pressing forward even as Illinois and New Jersey rescinded their calls out of fear of a conservative-dominated convention. Now, Wolfpack's early momentum also spooked some on the right, an illustration of the unusual alliances on both sides of the movement. In 2012, the Republican National Committee went so far as to pass a resolution formally opposing the conventional movement. Back in 2022, convention proponents and they have political winds at their backs. The movement right now seems to be gaining steam, and what's interesting is it seems to be gaining steam on both left and right. Carla Jones, Senior Director of International Relations and Federalism at ALEC, told Insider. The feeling that Washington, D.C. has become a cause for the nation's problems rather than the solution is becoming universal on both sides of the aisle. No, I don't want. See, I'm not a Democrat. I'm not a Republican, and I do not want to live in a Republican-controlled state because they have nothing to offer their base. So that's not, like I said, this is not going to work for me. Now, so far, 19 Republican-controlled states, including 4 in 2022 alone, which is Nebraska, South Carolina, West Virginia, and Wisconsin, have passed applications and calls for a constitutional convention under the model that was pushed by the conservative nonprofit group Convention of States, an offshoot of Citizens for Self-Governance. Because of their efforts, it's the first time that any of these applications have had this much movement in quite some time. This is what Vicki Harrison, who's the director of Constitutional Convention on Protecting Dissent on Programs at Common Cause, told Insider. Now, the passage of 4 new convention calls in states, including South Carolina, is a brutal loss. Citizens for Self-Governance and Convention of States, that's led by former Tea Party activist and ex-Parler CEO Mark Meckler, are relatively newer and well-funded players on the scene with connections to wealthy and powerful conservative interests. Now, tax filings obtained by the Center for Media and Democracy reveal the groups, which are not required to close their donors. They have received millions from the Cook Connected Donors Trust, the Mercer family, and groups linked to powerful conservative lawyer like Leonard Leo. A 2020 internal audit of Convention of States obtained by the group revealed that a $1.3 million donation that was made in Bitcoin made up 16% of the group's budget in 2019. 2 donations totaling $2.5 million accounted for 36% of the group's 2020 budget. Now, while the various offshoots of the movement may have momentum on their side, they don't yet have the map to get to 34 states. So, as it was necessarily to call a convention, some are skeptical that they ever will. And no matter how well Republicans do at the polls in 2022 and beyond, it's clear to everybody working on this that the convention proponents have no honest path to 34 states. This is what David Super, who's a professor and constitutional law expert at Georgetown University Law Center, had told Insider. Basically, they reached their fucking limit. But several conventional organizers and sycophantic inbreds say that they don't need a convention to change the Constitution. Yes, they do. And you're not going to get it. The point to how fed up states push for a convention to directly elect the U.S. senators after the Senate for years refused to consider resolutions calling for a direct election. The 17th Amendment that was ratified in 1912 is a testament to the strategy. Now, more than a century later, one prominent Republican sees history, at least procedurally, repeating itself. Now, what is most likely is that we move closer to a convention of the states, that at the last minute Congress will blink and pass the underlying amendments, and that's what history shows us is likely to happen. GOP Senator Ted Cruz of Texas, a former presidential candidate who was eyeing another run in 2024, told Insider, Cruz, who's a piece of shit, like himself, is pushing a term limits amendment, and he also did not express definitive support for a convention. And because the states have never called a convention under Article 5 since the Constitution was created, the exact mechanics are the subject of intense debates between legal scholars and activists. The prospect of a free-for-all convention has scared lawmakers away from other historic efforts to rewrite the nation's constitution, fearing that a debate on imposing term limits or a balanced budget could quickly morph into a full-fledged redesigning of gun, abortion, religious or free speech rights. Now, Republican organizations such as the John Birch Society, they're opposing a convention out of fear that it could open the door to weakening constitutional rights. Now, so does Representative Andy Biggs of Arizona, who's a staunch Trump nutlicker, who wrote an entire book, The Con of the Con, about the dangers of conventions in states where you would have expected this to pass. Because they have Republican leadership, they're firmly on our side because they're scared about losing guns, Harrison said. They're really not on your side. Now, Nadelson, who has published numerous writings and academic articles on Article 5, had basically said that people who fear a runaway convention don't know what they're fucking talking about, and the Republican legislators that have resisted calling a convention all these worries have been sold a bill of goods. Now, these academics who go for about the legislator and say things like, we don't know anything about the process, it could be a runaway convention without exception, as people who have never published any scholarship on the subject, he said. Advocates for a constitutional convention have published narrow visions for a convention that they would say would bind future delegates from passing extreme amendments. Nadelson, who argued that not a single convention of colonies, compact of states, or simulated convention that have held since the nation's founding has run away from its mandate. Now, at the convention, the United States 2016 mock convention in Williamsburg, Virginia, like the delegates, including Eastman, voted out 6 amendments, including a proposal that would eviscerate the 16th Amendment, which grants Congress the ability to impose an income tax. The resolution the group was pushing would limit a convention to amendments that impose fiscal restraints on the federal government. It would limit its power and jurisdiction and impose term limits on its officials and members of Congress. Now, limiting the power and jurisdiction of the federal government is an expansive mandate that would encompass virtually anything, and it would enable delegates to pass extreme amendments while technically saying that within the bounds of the convention. I defy you to name a constitutional amendment that you might want that I couldn't characterize as one of the 3 things in the Convention of States. And you want to repeal the 14th Amendment equal protection clause that's limiting the power of the federal government to interfere with state laws. Almost anything you want you can characterize as one of those things. Recent blog post on the Convention of States website explicitly references the need for a convention to limit federal overreach on abortion, guns, and immigration. The Supreme Court has said that amending the Constitution is a political question in which the federal courts cannot get involved. Now, the president will have no role and no say-so in this process, and the whole point of the convention route is to sideline Congress, so Congress can't overrule the convention. So there's no one to interfere. There's no one to stop a convention from doing whatever they fucking want to do. Now, states have the flexibility to meet their calls for a convention, and some have included penalties to keep delegates in line. Indiana and Florida have even made it a felony for convention delegates to defy the legislators' intent measures that they passed all along, the pro-convention resolutions. So, Super, however, had said that criminal penalties punishing rogue delegates are not constitutional or enforceable because of the Supreme Court's ruling back in 2000 and the Bush vs. Gore that their home state's laws don't bind state officers performing the national duties. Now, putting legal constraints aside, Nadelson argued that a runaway convention could only happen at horse and buggy times with minimal communication between delegates and legislators, and it would be practically impossible in 2022, a world that's driven by a 24-hour news cycle and instant methods of communications like calling and texting. They're going to be under the glare of publicity, and everybody's going to be watching every minute, Nadelson said. The framers also added a second buffer to the process. Conventions or Congress can only propose a constitutional amendment by 3/4 of the state legislators, which is 38, need to ratify it into the Constitution, a process that is not subject to a governor or president's veto. Now, conservators and Democrats are alike say that this requirement would doom hyperpartisan or plain loony amendments. The convention has way more safeguards than Congress itself. Nick Tumulty's executive director of U.S. Term Limits, a group pushing for a convention solely focused on imposing congressional term limits, told Insider, Controversial issues like taxes and guns and abortion need to not apply because you're never going to get through that gauntlet. Pearson had countered that a convention just passing a polarizing amendment would allow conservatives to play the long game and dominate the political debate in the country for the next decade with contentious ratification that battles in the state. It's a brilliant strategy for controlling the political agenda for a long time ahead. And this is what he had said. The behind closed doors, Meckler, Santorum, and Nadelson pitched a convention to the Republican lawmakers gathered at the December 2021 ALAC workshop as workshop as a way for ordinary citizenship to force sweeping changes to every facet of government. They would be aiming at the deep state and potentially the federal judiciary as well. This is what Meckler had told lawmakers in the closed-door session. It was a recording of which was obtained by the Center for Media and Democracy, and they shared it with Insider. Now, Meckler argued that in the session of that convention, they were focusing on term limits for every political position, which he criticized as dangerous or only a balanced budget amendment. It wouldn't be enough to rein in the federal government or to mobilize enough people behind the conventional movement. They have to be able to show people that they have a chance to get their hands around the throats of the federal government and put it back in the constitutional box. None of the individual efforts do that. The only thing that provides the narrative that drives 5 million people to participate in the Convention of States is a full package. Now, moments later, Meckler said his effort could be judged by his enemies, railing against a slew of Democratic advocacy groups to oppose the convention. It's every Democratic group in America. He basically called Democrats radical when in fact the radical group is the Republicans. Basically, when you're talking about the Democrats destroying America and they're talking about destroying life itself, technically that's what the Republicans are doing. Basically, when you say that they hate America, you're talking about Republicans hating America because they don't do anything to help their fellow American. Basically, you're talking about Democrats wanting to destroy America. That's technically what Trump did and what the Republicans done, and they're against Convention of States. Santorum also assured lawmakers that conservative interests would be strongly represented in a one-vote per state convention due to the outsized influence of lower population states, saying that we have the opportunity as a result of this to have a supermajority, even though we may not even be in an absolute majority when it comes to the people who we agree with. The conservative movement isn't resting on the laurels of its victories in the Supreme Court arena, but it's aggressively pioneering new frontiers to reshape every aspect of American law and society. And with a no-holds-barred constitutional convention, it may seem far off that the ideological fervor driving the convention movement and the ambitious aims of its proponents guarantee it won't be going away anytime soon. This is the opportunity that the founders gave you, state legislators. They gave you the power to fix this country. Santorum told lawmakers gathered at the 2021 ALEC meeting, his voice booming with all due respect, how dare you not try? How dare you in the face of what's going on in this country? Because we don't want to basically do anything that you're trying to do. So if you like the video, give the video a like and subscribe to my channel, RBW King. You can hit the notification bell so that you know when a new video comes out. And if you want to support my work even further, you can donate to my Patreon link, which you can find in the About section of YouTube. And for just as little as a few bucks a month, your donation can help go a long way. And thanks for listening.